Have you ever had the feeling that the world is mad or absurd in a way you can't quite put your finger on? In that moment, nothing seems to make sense, and life itself takes on this bewildering, frustrating property. It's like there's a fundamental disconnect between you and reality, and it feels like you are the only person noticing just how bizarre and uncomfortable the world truly is. There is one author who famously gives voice to these strange and often difficult to put into words feelings. This is Franz Kafka, and today we're going to take a look at his world, the world of the Kafkaesque, and why I think almost everyone could benefit from becoming more acquainted with it. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Kafka and Absurdity. The term absurd has become pretty closely associated with the French philosopher Albert Camus, who famously used the term the absurd to designate the tension between our human hunger for secure, certain, authoritative meaning and the absence of any such meaning out there in the universe. However, if we were to abstract away from this particular case of existential meaning, we find that Camus has highlighted an even broader conflict, the conflict between the general human wish to make the world understandable versus the strange, mind-boggling, understanding-defying complexity of reality as it actually exists. There are even points where Camus himself hints at this kind of idea, such as the following passage from The Myth of Sisyphus. In a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between a man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. And it is this kind of alienating, understanding, eluding absurdity that I think Kafka's work distills down in unparalleled intensity. And it will form the first plank of our analysis of the Kafkaesque and why I think it is so relevant. One of the first things that most people notice about Kafka is that the worlds in his stories are undeniably very strange. They're characterized by this dreamlike logic where settings can shift and change, characters can appear out of nowhere, and the base layer of reality itself seems arbitrary and thus unsettling. It is tempting to think of this as the Kafkaesque, and indeed many people use the term in this way perfectly sensibly. However, I do think that there's a deeper layer here. It's not just that Kafka's realities are insensible, it's that there is a constant tension between the world's insensibility and the wish for the protagonists of the story to make sense of their situation. Without that tension, I just don't think that Kafka's works would have their uniquely uncomfortable air. And I do mean that this stretches all the way down to the foundational layer of Kafka's fictional realities. In one of his lesser-known works, called The Country Doctor, there are disappearing horses, a totally inconsistent sense of distance, and sudden shifts in the world itself that defy all common sense or experience. You get the idea that the eponymous Doctor is actively having to fight the nature of space in order to achieve his goal of healing his patient. A lot of this reality-bending stuff is found in Kafka's short stories. In a one-page story called A Message from the Emperor, a messenger is, appropriately, given a message to deliver from an emperor. But when he sets out on his journey, or at least tries to, he finds that the palace itself is impossibly big. Its staircases are too vast. Its courtyards are untraversable. And not only that, but the city itself seems so huge that he could never cross it. In both of these cases, material reality as an understandable fact of the world begins to break down in a way that stands directly opposed to our protagonists. I wanted to mention this point because discussions around the Kafkaesque often focus primarily on frustrations surrounding bureaucracy and the inscrutability of social organizations, and I do think that's really important. In fact, I will be focusing on this mostly as well. But it's worth noting that in Kafka's works, not all frustration is totally man-made. He's not trying to set up some kind of romantic opposition between the comforting simplicity of nature or the untraversed world and the labyrinthine artificial machinations of man. Kafka's view of the world as confusing and bewildering is writ right into the base layer. To quote one of his aphorisms, which was written very late in his life and is probably one of the only examples of a totally philosophical Kafkan work, we were created to live in paradise, and paradise was designed to serve us. Our designation has been changed. We are not told whether this has happened to paradise as well. I think this aphorism has an almost semi-Gnostic feel to it, at least in the loose sense of the word, and it paints humanity's condition as going a lot deeper than just frustrations with the social world, and it seems to take a more existential position. It sets up a mismatch between the sort of environment that humanity would naturally find sensible, meaningful, and fulfilling, and the world as it actually exists, at least in Kafka's view and Kafka's experience. But before moving on, if you're finding the world a little bit bewildering and difficult to make sense of, one less philosophical reason for that might be the difficulty of navigating a modern newsfeed, which is why I recommend you check out today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on the story that America may have to issue refunds for tariffs if the Supreme Court rules that Trump overstepped. Whereas left-wing sources emphasized the economic damage caused by tariffs and argued that it was an overstep, right-wing sources chose to emphasize some of Trump's reasoning behind the tariffs and broadly defended his decisions. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by either the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing sources missing possible Republican redistricting efforts in Kansas and Nebraska, or right-wing sources missing pushbacks from federal judges on Trump's expansion of executive power. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias individually. So receiving my Ground News Roundup at the end of every day means that I can get a variety of news opinions, help gather which sources are more trustworthy, and just generally make the world less of a confusing mess. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They've genuinely become my go-to news source, and I sincerely hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. But make no mistake, the majority of the absurdity in Kafka's works is built very much on top of this base layer by the people and social structures in his stories. Take the trial, for example. There is little mind-bending physics in the way that there sometimes is in his short stories, but the court system itself continually frustrates our protagonist, Joseph K., who is just trying to make sense of his own situation and hopefully clear his name. We'll get into the more psychological readings of this story later in the video, but I don't think the story is only a reflection on Kafka's inner sense of guilt, which is pretty deep-seated. I think it is also a commentary on the frustrations of being trapped into a social system that, at least for you, is incomprehensible, but that everyone else seems to understand perfectly well through some kind of semi-superhuman sense. For most of the story, Kay is thrown between lawyers, judges, court officials, attendants, and more, who each talk to him as if he's meant to already perfectly understand his situation and should already know how to behave at each step along the way. Kay is baffled in the face of the endlessly confusing court system, and yet he is helpless to do anything to fight against it. But so what, you might say? This is all pretty standard Kafka stuff. The point I want to bring out, really, is that Joseph K. did not always see the world like this. It is implied that before his arrest and his eponymous process, he was an accomplished professional who had no awareness of the intricate nonsense of the legal system churning beneath his feet. Kafka's protagonists normally start as people who fit into their societies or their previous societies, and then something happens which forces them to become aware of some hitherto unnoticed absurdity. And importantly, this awareness of the absurdity of their societies is brought on and indeed is almost constituted by increased knowledge. K is forced to look at his society more closely because of his ongoing trial. The absurdity was always there. It was just being experienced by some other set of unfortunate people. This, again, to me, suggests that the Kafkaesque is not that the world became absurd at some point, but that the world was always absurd, and hopefully we were fortunate enough to drift through it without too much friction up until now. Joseph K becomes less able to interact with his world the more that his eyes are opened to what his world is actually like. It's a very interesting conflict. And it's the fact that no one else notices the absurdity that lends Kafka's stories part of their sense of isolation. Joseph K is stuck with knowledge that it seems very few other people have in quite the same way that he does. That is, knowledge about what it's like to be on trial in this system. And yet, this knowledge and the fact that he is on trial also means that no one will listen to him. He is exiled from the realm of sensible discussion precisely because he has undergone events that means he knows more about the world than the people around him in a kind of phenomenological first-person experiential sense. In terms of the worlds themselves, I think it's the combination of the following three factors that I think lends Kafka's stories their particular uncomfortable tone. A, the world is in fact absurd, either at the level of physical space or social organization. B, this absurdity frustrates or resists our protagonist in some way. But C, the people around the protagonist do not or cannot acknowledge or care about the absurdity. And I think one of the reasons Kafka's work has endured is that most of us have been in this situation in some way, shape, or form, though hopefully not in quite as an extreme way. I'll give you one example from my own life that I think is fairly representative of the kind of everyday, almost trivial Kafkaesque experience. So I'd been falsely charged a pretty exorbitant amount of money by an old energy company to the tune of a few £100s at a time when money was really quite tight. I was, of course, immediately onto their customer service representatives, at which point I was thrown between many different departments before finally arriving at one that said they could help me. I was then told that I would get a check in the post in the next 2 weeks refunding me. Lo and behold, 2 weeks pass and nothing arrives, so I'm back on the phone to the representatives, which takes up another few hours, almost an entire day, before I go through the exact same conversation with a new person. They acknowledge the mistake, at least half-heartedly, and say that they will post the check this time, but the check never arrives, so I'm back on the phone, getting told the same story for the third time, and I never ended up getting refunded this money that I actually quite needed, purely because the energy company obviously had more resources than me, and I as an individual had neither the time, energy, or the money to take them to something like small claims court over it. All the while, the representatives themselves couldn't really admit how absurd this all was, because they were representing the company and they were just trying to limit liability. And look, I know that that's a pretty trivial and kind of mundane example, but I also do think that because of its mundanity, so many people have been in this kind of situation. And I think that this kind of situation can really matter sometimes. I mean, I'm lucky. I could still afford my rent and I just had to tighten my belt for a couple of months. And I'm doing much better now, so I wouldn't even be in that situation if the same thing happened again. But if I were in a more precarious situation, well, it could have got me evicted from my flat if I just ran out of money and couldn't pay rent. On top of it all, there was no individual person that I could blame. It was all the work of some nebulous organization that had no face. It had a name with LTD at the end of it, and no consciousness or conscience. I mean, sure, I am and was fine, but I couldn't help but think of others who are shut inside the corridors of corporate machinery, having their time and energy sapped away, all while they're just trying to reclaim money that they need, and possibly need to survive. It's the incomprehensible facelessness of a force that has an awful lot of power over you that Kafka's work speaks to. And whether that comes in the form of algorithms deciding if you get a mortgage, whether you're trying and failing to navigate the quagmire of a struggling healthcare system, or even directly engaging in some kind of tortuous legal battle, your fate dictated by obscure statutes that you can't understand without years of training. In each case, I imagine it is incredibly hard to get across to people that there is a rot going unacknowledged in some aspect of our society. Take a childhood friend of mine, for example. It took her multiple years to get a diagnosis for her endometriosis due to a mixture of doctors just not taking her seriously, extreme waiting times, and delayed tests. And by the time her diagnosis came through and she could get some treatment and a treatment plan, it had progressed further. And now, despite desperately wanting to be a mother, she is less likely to be able to have children. And part of the reason for that is because she was stuck in a Kafkaesque maze for years, and yet she still struggles to get anyone who has not been in her situation to accept that something might have been wrong, that she was going through an unfair and debilitating process. Absurdity, helplessness, and total bewilderment from anyone else. This is the world that Kafka paints. And while you might not think that it characterizes the universe itself at a philosophical level, it undeniably gives voice to a common experience, and yet one that, despite its commonality, leaves us feeling like we are the only ones to have gone through it. And again, although my example is trivial, I don't think my friend's is at all. But enough with my ranting. There is another important aspect of the Kafkaesque that, again, speaks to a very common yet rarely acknowledged human experience that I think that we could probably all relate to. Being watched, and more importantly, being judged. 2. The feeling of observation. I had an ever so slightly strange realization the other day, and that is that myself and a lot of people my age have lived their entire life with this general expectation that there are cameras everywhere and that almost everything that we do can be recorded and then displayed online, where if it hits an algorithm in just the right way, it will then be further displayed to potentially millions of people who will view this moment of candid capture as the day's entertainment, maybe passing judgment, maybe simply laughing, but either way, we would become an object in their world, a thing on a screen whose entire essence is distilled down to this one moment in time. I think of all the times that I've been the spectator to this sort of thing, mindlessly, internally picking someone apart over a mere snapshot of their life, and I can't help but think that Franz Kafka would be deeply disappointed in me. All through his life, Kafka had a profound fear of being watched, observed, and judged. Perhaps the most famous thing he ever did was request that his unpublished works be burnt, and they would have been had not his friend, Max Brod, preserved them for our benefit. Kafka did not want them to be seen. Perhaps the origin of this fear of observation and judgment in Kafka comes from his relationship to his father, Hermann. In his letter to my father, Kafka alludes to how he grew up in this constant terror of his father's judgment of him and over him. Kafka details how his father felt like an immense, almost godlike presence, and that he thought Hermann saw Kafka as a vaguely pathetic figure. In short, Kafka slowly inculcated the idea that whenever Hermann saw him clearly, he did not like what he saw. We obviously don't have Hermann's view on things, but at the very least, this was how Kafka experienced his childhood. And it was not standard physical abuse that Kafka feared from his father, it was his father's judgment. This is reflected in one of his fictional works that is appropriately called The Judgment, where a fictionalized version of Kafka's father literally drowns him in his disapproval, and the protagonist is dying, choking on this water. Kafka was 29 when he wrote that story, and he was far from being a child, obviously, and yet the spectre of Hermann's judgment never quite left him. In his letter, which was written a few years later, he complains that his father disapproved of his writing, of Kafka's chosen, if temporary, fiancés, and his general demeanour. There is the constant sense that Kafka loathes himself for being vulnerable to his father's opinions and judgments, and yet he also can't help but be struck by each and every one. He's caught in this self-reinforcing, vicious cycle. And it's not just his father's judgment that Kafka fears. As Elias Canetti argues in his very impressive essay on Kafka called Kafka's Other Trial, Kafka's later works, including most notably The Trial, are heavily influenced by a pretty pivotal experience he had in 1914. This was during his first engagement to Felice Bauer, and Kafka was accused of behaving inappropriately with a woman who was not his fiancée. As a result, he was confronted by a number of people all at once in an event that Canetti describes as an informal tribunal. It's not really clear to what extent the accusations were true. In his diaries, Kafka claims that he was totally exonerated, yet to look at some of the letters he sent to this other woman, it's not 100% clear. At the very least, we can be pretty certain that nothing physical happened, yet Kafka may well have lent some of his amorous emotion to someone who was decidedly not his betrothed. This event led to the breakdown of his first engagement to Felice Bauer, and it only exacerbated Kafka's underlying fear of being observed. Also, just put a pin in this general idea of Kafka feeling guilty or shameful, as we'll be coming back to it in the next section. And this anxiety around being watched is heavily reflected in almost all of his works. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this is most prominent in the trial itself. An important recurring motif of the story is that Joseph K. is always being watched, or almost always at least. Primarily, this occurs through the nebulous sense that the court system is keeping an eye on him or keeping track of him, but it stretches far beyond this. Notably, in one scene, K is visiting someone in the vain hope that this person might be able to help K with his case, and people gather outside to watch through the windows. There is no sense that these watchers are agents of the court or even affiliated with the justice system, but they display this morbid interest in K anyway. In another scene, K is attempting to speak at his own defense at a hearing, and he is scrutinized by the assembled company. They sometimes seem like they're getting behind him, and they sometimes seem to be condemning him, and the consensus at the end of the speech is that K has harmed his own case. This becomes a theme whenever K commits any kind of action or deigns to try and take some control in his life. He is told he is harming his case. He cannot, no matter how hard he attempts it, escape observation and the inevitable accompanying judgment that goes along with it. Something K quickly learns in the trial, and the protagonist of The Castle, also called K, similarly learns this lesson, is that there's basically no way to beat those judging him. In each one of his actions, there is enough ambiguity that someone can take it or twist it against him, because there's an inherent ambiguity in almost every action and almost every linguistic communication. In the end, both protagonists of the trial and The Castle end up deeply unsure of their own innocence or position. What begins as shame imposed from the outside becomes guilt erupting from the inside. Kafka's stories are excellent at illustrating a deeply interesting philosophical thesis, that the judgments people make about us are not something that we can simply ignore and move on with our lives, as much as we would like to do so. Sure, it may be possible to write off an individual person's judgment of you, but the prevailing tide of social forces is borderline impossible to just set aside because it affects our life in such profound ways. We are social creatures. And moreover, this nebulous social judgment is such an amorphous and impersonal force that no individual person feels responsible for it. None of the individual people who judge K through his trial embrace this as individuals who are responsible for the consequences of their action. The people who arrest him are just doing their job, and most of the others are just faces in a crowd. They don't really see K as fully human. He's a passing object in their maps of the world. It reminds me a little bit of how Kierkegaard characterizes public judgment as a force that's so abstract that no one ends up taking or facing responsibility for it, even as it ravages through other people's lives. Maybe the strongest condemnation of judgment itself in Kafka's works is his short story called In the Penal Colony. Here we are shown a prison where the officer in charge of punishment is so sure of his moral superiority that he is willing to thoughtlessly condemn prisoners to a truly vicious and torturous death at the hands of a quite brutal machine. This machine had had its glory days, and it was the pride of the previous regime and the pride of the previous commandant of the prison, but now there are all these newfangled ideas under the new commandant, and the machine is beginning to be seen for the horrible execution device that it actually is. Realizing that his moral system is falling out of favor, and soon he will be the person that's seen as a monster, the officer submits himself to the machine, which malfunctions and breaks apart, ending both him and itself in the process. The moral system he wielded like a weapon comes back to bite him. Now, it's very tempting when presented with narratives like these to immediately compare them to times where we have been judged, observed, and victimized. And no doubt you can think of occasions where you were offered up on a trough to the jaws of social condemnation. However, it is worth noting that the vast majority of the people in Kafka's works are not those on the receiving end of judgment, but the judges and judgers themselves. Luckily, most of us have probably not been subjected to the kind of intense scrutiny of K, but how many of us have passed judgment on someone who is really no worse than we are? How often have we set the bar for what makes a good person as just slightly below us? And if we were honest with ourselves, if someone could see every action of our lives laid out like a book, how often would they be disgusted with us, repulsed by our amorality or even immorality or our rudeness or the mere overwhelming cruelty of our thoughts? How often do we put on unspoilt moral garments that we have in no way earned? If I look back, I have done all of this and more. I'm willing to bet that most of us in this respect are not like K at all, but are more like the officer in the penal colony, the temporary owner of the hammer of moral authority who will one day be crushed beneath its weight as well. To bring this back to the Kafkaesque and the notion of judgment, my point is that we tend to look at this concept from the perspective of Kafka's protagonists, the beleaguered victims of the Kafkaesque world that they inhabit. But there is no Kafkaesque world without the innumerable people holding these worlds together, and the victims of Kafka's narratives are far outnumbered by the perpetrators, and each perpetrator has the benefit of turning to the person next to them and reassuring themselves that what they did was not cruel, it was just, and the person before them is not worthy of moral consideration or compassion or kindness, but deserves everything that they get. And perhaps, reflecting on all of this, you might find yourself becoming a little bit guilty. I know that I do. But luckily, Kafka has a lot to say on this topic as well. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. 3. The emotional resonance of the Kafkaesque. The effects of all of this judgment on Kafka himself is pretty palpable. It's not just that he was scared of the judgment of other people, but he lived with a near-permanent internal feeling of inadequacy and guilt that stretched across almost every aspect of his life and lasted the duration of his life. Another theme that comes across in many of Kafka's works is that he has no real confidence that any of his interpersonal connections will last all that long or remain that stable. There's this real sense of fragility to each one of his protagonists' relationships. Kafka often gives the sense that he is something of a performing monkey, and that the majority of his companions are just kept around because he's providing them with adequate entertainment, at least in his view and in the views of his protagonists. Nowhere is this clearer than in Kafka's short story, The Hunger Artist. This, to simplify things somewhat, follows a performer whose whole job is to go long amounts of time without eating in a feat of human endurance that people would go and watch and admire. The Hunger Artist's act is slowly getting less popular, and he's being abandoned by the crowds who used to adore him. He embarks on one last great fast, which eventually culminates in his death. And yet, on his deathbed, he makes a strange confession. In what almost comes across like a fit of guilt, he admits that he only became a hunger artist because he never really found any food that he liked. His motivation was as trivial as that. It was not a feat of endurance for him, but just the result of his natural inclinations. He puts this idea forward as if it makes him a fraud or an imposter, and then he passes away to be forgotten by pretty much everyone. I find this story fascinating because of two key components. The first is that the hunger artist is abandoned as soon as people get bored, and his only worth to those who seem to adore him was as passing entertainment. This obviously connects with Kafka's own insecurities around others and his fear of the crowd, which we touched upon in the last section. But this final confession adds another layer. The hunger artist displays guilt and a feeling that he has been lying to the people around him this whole time. And this notion of a closely guarded secret, something that's only hinted at by the narrative but seems to get to the core of the psyche of the protagonist, runs through a lot of Kafka's works. Let's again revisit the trial. One of the strangest aspects of this story is that Joseph K. rarely, if ever, outright denies his supposed crime. You can argue that his bewilderment at the arrest itself is, in effect, an innocent plea, and that his continual efforts to clear his name are evidence that he, at some level, finds himself innocent, but he struggles to say unequivocally that he has done nothing wrong. Of course, part of this is that he's given no information about what he's accused of, but this sets up the story to be a kind of perfect allegory for a strange, subtle feeling of guilt that just hums on in the background of Kafka's life. In his aphorisms, for example, Kafka seems almost obsessed with the notion of evil and of the idea that humanity has some kind of original sin. For example, here's just one passage. Ever since original sin, we are basically all alike in our ability to know good and evil. Even so, this is where we seek a particular advantage. Actually, it's only after knowledge that the real differences begin. The appearance to the contrary is provoked in the following way. No one can be satisfied with understanding alone, but must make an effort to act in accordance with it. He lacks the strength to do so, therefore he must destroy himself, even at the risk of not receiving the necessary strength. It is simply that he has no option other than to undertake this final effort. The effort is daunting. One would rather reverse the original knowledge of good and evil. Now, of course, this can be taken in many ways. Like almost all aphorisms, its point is to get us to wrestle with it rather than take its word as gospel. But within the context of Kafka's stories, there is a rather unsettling interpretation. Kafka presents us with original sin, but without any kind of redemption, either through following the law or through Christ. It is a picture of humanity where we are forever falling short of our duties and are deeply unworthy of the life granted to us, that is, the tree of life. And it's one that, at the very least, Kafka had of himself. This same sort of thing occurs in The Castle, where the protagonist wavers between thinking of himself as a selfish bastard, simply using the other people around him and his own romantic partner for his own benefit, and an alternative view where he is just a relatively good person trying to make the best of a pretty sorry and bewildering situation. There's always a persistent voice at the back of his head, keeping track of all of the little ways he is failing. It is this sense of failure, both moral and practical failure, that runs through so many of Kafka's tales and contributes to this overriding sense of guilt and inadequacy. And, of course, no discussion of guilt or shame in Kafka would be complete without the inclusion of the Metamorphosis, the famous story of Gregor Samsa, who awakes one morning from uneasy dreams to discover that he has been transformed into a monstrous vermin, which is normally depicted as a dung beetle. This helps elucidate Kafka's feelings around guilt in two ways. The first is that Gregor's transformation makes explicit something that largely remains internal among most of Kafka's protagonists, that he is or feels lesser than the people around him and in some way monstrous. The psychological is given a metaphysical interpretation here. However, the story also describes the destructive effects of guilt and shame, both on Gregor and his wider family. Gregor's family are deeply ashamed of the newly in-beetled Gregor, and they do their best to lock him away in his room, far from the prying eyes of other people and that judgment that we've already discussed. Their shame is eventually transplanted onto Gregor, as each member of the family goes from feeling a kind of general sympathy with him to being scared and embarrassed by his very presence. Eventually, and spoiler alert, Gregor is killed by the festering wound of an apple thrown at him in anger by his father, and the family all feel relieved upon his death, as they've now got their life back from the transformed Gregor who had dominated their minds for so many months. Many analyses focus on Gregor's feelings of guilt and shame, and how his identity is stripped away and he sees himself as failing in his duties as the working man of the house. And I've talked about that on the channel before, but here I want to focus a little more on the family themselves. The most obvious reason the family come to hate Gregor is just this social stigma and external shame of having an enormous beetle in their home, a symbol of everything that's disgusting and vile. However, and I fully admit that I may be reading a bit too much into the text here, I sense that the family also becomes guilty of their own shame and own treatment towards Gregor. After all, Gregor is their beloved boy, and societally it is frowned upon to reject your son in this fashion. And their resentment that he is unable to work, through no fault of his own, is hardly morally becoming of them. In a strange way, Gregor's presence and their natural instinctive reaction to his presence is a stark reminder of their own moral failings and would naturally produce some kind of guilt. Gregor symbolizes this general idea that the family are quite changeable, and perhaps that they only really valued Gregor for what he did for them. When the family feels relieved at the end with Gregor's death, it could be because they can now retreat back into their illusions about their own moral status. The symbol of their guilt is eliminated. Gregor is obviously himself made to feel inadequate as a beetle, but the family is also made to feel inadequate by how they react. Again, this is largely a personal interpretation. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this was Kafka's intention or anything like that. But I do think it is an interesting reading of the text, and I do think that it latches onto quite a lot of Kafka's feelings of vicious guilt that are illustrated, and we touched upon the last section with the example of In the Penal Colony. So, if I were to sum up my reading of the feelings of inadequacy and guilt in Kafka's stories, it would probably be in the following rough thought. Kafka seems to perceive the human condition as run through with failures to live up to our potential and our stated values, and that this applied to his life in a particularly sharp way, what with his self-perceived failures as a writer and as a son. However, such inner feelings of lack are not only self-directed, but they come to hurt the people around us as well. In our quest to make ourselves feel larger than we are, we lash out at anything that makes us aware of our nagging inner guilt, our nagging inadequacy. The real, emotional, deeply human violence of Gregor's family stands in stark contrast to the abstract, impersonal violence of the previous sections, which is one reason why I don't think that it is as helpful to equate the oppressive force of Gregor's family, with the oppressive force of the court system in the trial or the overarching government of the castle. So we've now moved on from the causes and forces of the Kafkaesque to the feelings it produces. I view the family as just as much victims of the Kafkaesque as perpetrators of it. And for me, the final stage of those stuck in a Kafkaesque situation in Kafka's stories is this sort of helpless inner guilt. The guilt comes licked with cruelty that will either discharge itself onto others, as in the case of Samsa's family, or will simply eat the person up inside, as in the case of Gregor himself, or our various Ks. In effect, that judging voice that we discussed in the last section becomes internalized into an extremely anxious and vindictive conscience, one that is convinced that they have never and can never move past their innate sin. This preoccupation with guilt is probably best summed up in the final lines of the trial, and spoiler alert if you haven't finished the book, because I am about to tell you the ending. The hands of one of the gentlemen were laid on Kafka's throat, while the other pushed the knife deep into his heart and twisted it there. As his eyesight failed, Kay saw the two gentlemen cheek by cheek, close in front of his face, watching the result. Like a dog, he said. It was as if the shame of it should outlive him. For Kay, concerns about guilt, shame, and judgment have overtaken even his drive to live. And for Kafka, this battle with his own feelings of guilt and inadequacy persisted right up to his final days. He was always battling this extreme inner voice of judgment. Some of the last writings of Kafka that we have are his letters to Milena, a woman who he formed an intense attachment to. And he sometimes does treat her as if she was one of the only people to ever truly understand his works, in his view. And Milena wrote quite a touching obituary for Kafka, which I would like to read a section for you now, because I think that it sums up Kafka's oeuvre and work much better than I ever could. He has written the most significant books of modern German literature, books that embody the struggle of today's generation throughout the world while refraining from all tendentiousness. They are true, stark, and painful, to the point of being naturalistic even where they are symbolic. They are full of dry scorn and the sensitive perspective of a man who saw the world so clearly that he couldn't bear it. A man who was bound to die, since he refused to make concessions or take refuge, as others do, in various fallacies of reason or the unconscious, even the more noble ones. Dr. Franz Kafka wrote The Stoker, the first chapter of a wonderful, still unpublished novel. The Judgment, the conflict of two generations. The Metamorphosis, the most powerful book in modern German letters. In the Penal Colony, and the collections Meditation and A Country Doctor. The last novel, Before the Law, has been in manuscript form, ready to print for years. It is one of those books which, upon reading, leaves the impression of a world so perfectly portrayed that any further comment is superfluous. All of his books paint the horror of secret misunderstandings, of innocent guilt between people. He was an artist and a man of such anxious conscience, he could hear even where others, deaf, felt themselves secure. Franz Kafka is one of my favourite authors, and I always have trouble putting the effect of his books into words because they touch upon this strange concoction of human feelings that might only be communicable through the kind of absurd fictional narratives that he paints. I hope that we don't often feel enmeshed in the claws of the Kafkaesque ourselves, but from time to time, we will inevitably inhabit the same sort of emotional space that Kafka did at his darkest and most tortured moments. I think one of the reasons why Kafka's stories have become such a cultural touchstone is because of their ability to display a kind of stark emotional reality. The physical world around us may not be as incomprehensible as those often found in Kafka's stories, but there are points where it may as well be. We've all stood in harsh judgment of others on occasion, probably hypocritically, and we've all felt the sting of judgment ourselves. We may not have the same kind of crippling yet vague constant inner guilt as Kafka, but I have yet to meet someone without any feelings of inner shame or inadequacy that they find troubling and confusing, and yet they cannot quite escape them. Kafka's novels describe how absurd the feeling and experience of being human can sometimes be, and how bewildering, unsettling, and frightening reality can seem. Kafka is, on the face of it, one of the most anti-realistic writers ever to put pen to paper. And yet, his stories also capture the bewildering element of being alive through this very anti-naturalism. From the moment we are ripped from the familiar environment of the womb into a strange and confusing world, to the moment that we pass away again, still only knowing an infinitesimally small amount of the truth out there, we are absurd creatures. And I think this is the value of the Kafkaesque, at least for me. But to experience it, you will, of course, need to pick up one of his works for yourself, and I highly recommend that you do so. There really is no other writer like him. But if you do want to explore more about Kafka, specifically his general views and experience with love, then you can watch a video on this very topic right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.